So welcome to the 8th annual Adam and Anne Amory Parry Lecture, co-sponsored by the Departments of Classics and Comparative Literature. I'm Aisha Ramachandran, and on the comp lit end of things, it's my pleasure to welcome you and kick things off today. But before I do that, I want to give a big shout out to Kirk Freudenberg, Chair of Classics, who is running around organizing things here for all of the wonderful arrangements for today's lecture and reception that will follow. Before we start, a couple of practical matters. Let me invite you to take this moment to turn off your cell phones, or at least silence them. This lecture is being recorded and will be online, so I just want to give you a heads up that we hope you'll come use the mics to ask questions at the end, but you will be being recorded if that is a concern. And finally, there will be a reception right after this lecture in Phelps 401, right across Old Campus. Anyone with a Yale ID should be able to get into the building, take the elevator to the 4th floor. If you aren't sure you can get into the building, just tag on to the big group that I hope will be trundling over after the lecture. And please stay to celebrate the lecture and our speaker today. Okay, so supported by generous gifts from Professor Gilbert Lawal and James M. Morris, the Amory Parry Lecture remembers the husband and wife pair of scholars Anne Amory Parry and Adam Parry. Both trained in classical literature and philology, both interested in wider issues of literary criticism and the history of ideas, the Parrys were a formidable team who ended up teaching at Yale, where he became head of classics from 1968 to 1971. Though they died very young, their work had already established them as leaders in Homeric criticism and the study of other ancient texts, particularly Thucydides and Virgil. It is in the spirit of their wide-ranging, elegantly written, and exciting, groundbreaking scholarship that the annual Amory Parry Lecture brings to Yale speakers whose work continues in the traditions to which the Parrys belonged. So it is particularly fitting that today's lecture will be given by David Quint, Sterling Professor of Comparative Literature and English at Yale. David tells me that he remembers the Parrys and their tragic death, and his own astonishingly wide-ranging scholarship, which ranges from Homer to Proust, via Virgil, Tasso, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Milton, and the Arabian Nights, just to name a few highlights, emerges from and embodies the intellectual traditions of the Parrys. For many of us in this room, this is also a moment of culmination and celebration, to listen to David give the Parry Lecture. In both classics and comparative literature, we have learned from his immense erudition, as well as his deeply precise marginalia on many of our essays. He has been a sometimes terrifying model for the intellectual generosity and scholarly rigor of our fields. To introduce David properly, please join me in welcoming Alessandro Barchiesi, Professor of Classics at New York University. Welcome.
Hello, David. What a surprise. I shouldn't be here. I don't have a right to speak because people know you so well. But it's a fine day, so I was just having a walk around, and I noticed the poster of this event. So I thought, there's really something I want to tell you before you start, and it's actually about me. So, although at the end, as you might imagine, because you all know this kind of event, at the end I will say something like David Quint rules, or David Quint rocks, or David Quint is sick, or whatever the language is in this kind of occasion. So my final sentence will be something like that, David Quint rules. But, human memory is sedimentary, so let me go back to the very beginning of my knowledge of David Quint. David is now a dear friend of mine, but we don't go very far back. Initially, David was a presence in Pisa, where I was a junior professor of classics. And, we were all free-floating between the Scuola Normale and the only good coffee shop in Pisa, Caffè Salsa. You should try it. Many of us were interested in a project which was about the rejuvenation of classics. So the idea was basically that classics was really always behind the development of literary theory and literary criticism back then in the 80s. The very first important paper on imagery in Virgil by Bernard Knox came long after similar studies of Shakespeare. The very first influential negative reading of the Aeneid by Adam Parry was later than similar experiments on Milton, and so on. So there was this idea that classics should try to have more of a dialogue with literary theory and literary criticism. And when you start your career, it's very important that you have some kind of big hope for your field. What I didn't know is that one of the interesting answers was actually a young professor of Renaissance studies who was walking up and down with other people I knew and having coffee. The first thing I noticed about David is that, David, you know how to pick your friends and the people you talk to. You were hanging out with people I knew to be brilliant, like Lina Bolzoni, Sergio Zatti. You were talking to Francesco Orlando, the leading light of Pisan literary criticism. You were laughing at the jokes of Gianbiagio Conte, and so on. But back then, I didn't know that David had new answers to my quest. And the big shock after that was the publication of Epic and Empire, a book that marks a new step in the tradition of comparative criticism, because every single chapter is a protagonist in discussions of a single author, meaning that the chapter on Virgil, the chapter on Lucan, and many others are now central to critical discussions of Virgil and Lucan. It was a bit of a shock for me because I was hoping to rejuvenate classics from the inside out. And now I found out that someone under the flag of comparative criticism could achieve so much in just a single book. After that, I have had more attention to your production. And I came to realize that you are an authority in Milton, Cervantes, Montaigne, Tasso, Ariosto. So every time you enter a field, you change the conversation in that specialized field. We all say negative things about specialization, but it's also true that this approach to scholarship has created very competitive arenas for discussion. And regularly, David is a protagonist and a leader. So I obviously look forward to what you're going to say today. I just want to add that David is actually a rich person and also a citizen. I was surprised to learn about that because so many leading scholars I have met in my career are not really engaging reality as we know it. Now, David has been active in reforms and serious changes at Yale. He knows a lot about politics and has a strong sense of realpolitik. He was the only person, the only friend to tell me that Donald Trump was going to win the 2016 elections. You know, in a blue state, in academia, people were not, even if they knew it, they would not say that to me. I'm reminded that David's father was an important scholar of American history. So there are a number of things that I know about you now after reading Epic and Empire and after meeting you in Pisa. But the only important thing is that David Quint rocks.
We can go home now. It's been very difficult to follow that or live up to it. Thank you, Sandro. I want to thank Aisha Ramachandran and Kirk Freudenberg for the invitation to give this lecture in honor of Adam and Anne Parry, and I feel very honored to speak in their memory. I also want to thank both departments of classics and comparative literature for offering me this occasion, but also for all of the collegiality and friendship they have given me over my years at Yale. I was, in recent memory, a convener of this lecture series with Christina Kraus, whom I wish especially to thank for team teaching with me on Virgil's Aeneid, a really precious experience which is reflected in today's talk. This talk is part of a larger essay article, which is simply too long for a single talk. I tried to cut it down to a manageable 50 to 55 minutes. It is, like other work I've published, an attempt at a bird's eye view of the epic tradition that is more complicated when it's seen down on the ground. Its polemical cast is going to be clear from the very beginning. Does epic have a future tense? A now familiar critical idea advanced by Mikhail Bakhtin relegates epic to an archaic, closed past and to a fixed univocal meaning. Against this straw man, Bakhtin defines the novel as dialogical in meaning, speaking to the present, and open to the future. It's fine for the novel, it's the kiss of death for epic, and for the most part, it's bullshit. In the written text, it's baloney. Beginning with the Odyssey and looking back on the Iliad, epic poems look back from a later moment on their predecessors and models, and in doing so, they imagine how a later moment, a future, will look back on them. This retrospection projection becomes more intense as epic moves historically from the Homeric oral archaic world to first Hellenistic and Roman epic, and then another millennium later to the writing of epic poems along classical models in the Renaissance. Beginning with the Odyssey too, and then repeated as a topos in poem after poem, epic presents a scene that creates distance, temporal and historical, upon its heroic fiction, and that breaks out of its past, which was never the absolute self-contained past wrongly described by Hegelian critics. This particular type scene is the hospitality and banquet that the Phaeacian king Alcinous offers to Odysseus at Scheria in books 8 through 13 of the Odyssey. And the similar welcome and banquet, modeled on the Odyssey episode, that Dido gives for Aeneas at Carthage in books 1 and 3 of the Aeneid. To arrive at a Scheria or a Carthage is a kind of time travel into the future through a wormhole that opens out of the epic world. These episodes project a world and audience foreign to its heroic world that is also an alternative future or modernity, the world of its later readers. We readers are to see ourselves invited to the epic banquet and as part of the poem's internal addressees. It is assumed that we readers in the future may or may not share the heroic ethos of martial epic, ties as it is to an now archaic society. We are asked to measure our own values and versus that ethos, for better or for worse. The Scheria Carthage topic contains some of the following elements. His host grants to the wandering hero a safe harbor, at least a harbor that initially seems to be safe. The hero tells the story of his history and adventures at a banquet given in his honor. The host already appreciates stories of the hero. The Phaeacian singer Demodocus recounts the fighting at Troy. The Carthaginians have depicted Aeneas in the scenes of the Trojan War on the Temple of Juno. The two heroes weep at these stories, but the hosts have made them into objects of aesthetic entertainment. The hosts, the Phaeacians and Phoenicians of Carthage, live in a society that appears less heroic and warlike, but more materially advanced, more scientifically and technologically developed than the hero's own. The hero was already part of a past that is half mythical, and as Odysseus himself described in his storytelling, it's consigned partly to an underworld and to partly a dead past. The hero is in fact invited to leave his own world, perhaps to get with the living present and the way of the future, through marriage with the local princess. Alcinous offers to wed his daughter Nausicaa to Odysseus. Dido goes further. She starts an affair with Aeneas and declares herself his wife. The seafaring Phaeacians are wealthy sophisticates, unwarlike, vaguely effeminate. Their queen Arete seems to be their real ruler. They are better at dancing with a ball than at athletics. Sir Moses Finley speaks of Scheria as a kind of utopia, and indeed, beneath a thin poetic disguise, Phaeacian society appears to contain what Finley has observed elsewhere, to be conspicuously absent and excluded from the noble households of the Odyssey: trade, on the one hand, and the art of metalworking. The two are connected, for metals were the most important commodities of ancient merchants. The wealth of Alcinous and his landed aristocracy officially depends on the fabulous fertility of Scheria. And one Phaeacian nobleman insults Odysseus by telling him that he resembles a merchant seaman, a man of business grasping for profits. But it is the Phaeacians themselves, Nausicaa has told Odysseus, who have no concern with the bow and quiver, but it's all masts and oars of ships and the balanced vessels themselves in which they delight in crossing the gray sea. And that should be on this very long handout, which gives you an idea of just how much of this you have to endure. And indeed, the Phaeacians appear to have magic ships that not only move swift as thought or as winged creatures, but seem to understand men's thoughts and purposes, and they know all the cities of men. That is, the Phaeacian ships and their masters have navigated the entire Mediterranean, and they bear more than a passing resemblance, both in their wealth and in their name, to the despised Phoenician traders, gnawers of men's goods, who crop up repeatedly in Odysseus's lying stories in the second half of the poem, and also in Eumaeus's own life story. Homer also transfers to Scheria the metalworking wonders of the Iliad's Hephaestus. Outside the palace of Alcinous, itself adorned with bronze walls, silver columns, and golden doors, stand dogs of silver and gold, fashioned by Hephaestus to stand watch over the palace. Being themselves immortal, in all their days they are ageless. Now it's hard to know whether these dogs are mere statues, like the torch-bearing young men made of gold inside the palace, or whether they are automata, like those in the shape of young women who serve in Hephaestus's Olympian palace in the Iliad, in Iliad 18. The Phaeacian singer Demodocus sings two songs about the Trojan War. The second song culminates with the fighting around the house of Deiphobus, the second Trojan husband of Helen. In between, he tells about Hephaestus' straying wife, Aphrodite, and her lover, Ares. Ares, who has won her both with gifts and with his splendid person. Hephaestus traps the couple in a net so finely wrought as to be invisible. And this song defines, he traps them in a net that is so fine as to be invisible. This song defines a Phaeacian subject matter as opposed to the matter of epic. Hephaestus' metallurgical techne overcoming the god of war himself. One doesn't need to fight a Trojan war over an adulterous wife, nor write an Iliad about it. The divine smithy demands repayment of his epic courtship gifts, and Poseidon agrees to make sure that Ares pays the adulterer's damages. These are how such matters are handled on Olympus and in a civilized, wealthy society like that of the Phaeacians. The story anticipates the entrapment of Penelope's suitors, minus virtuous Penelope herself, through the craftiness of Odysseus in the Odyssey's second half. But in contrast, it makes the bloody ending of the poem feel like something like a recrudescence of an atavistic epic violence. It also expresses an all-too-human view of the Olympian gods, a measure of the skepticism that may accompany the, the materialist outlook of the Phaeacians. The smithy Hephaestus is their kind of god. In the aftermath of Troy, the Odyssey depicts a world that is already post-heroic, measuring the distance of its own early 8th century BCE audience from the epic past. It dramatizes this historical distance in the Phaeacians, who lie at an even greater removed, so post-heroic as to be non-heroic. Like many utopian fictions, they may lie in an imagined future, a readership of the poem that is yet to come. Enter Dido's Carthage. If Scheria registers what it means for the Odyssey to come after the Iliad and its heroic world, the Aeneid measures the nearly 1,000 years of human civilization, and in particular the rise of Rome and of literature in Latin, that separates it from the archaic world depicted in both Homeric epics. It does so by presenting the versions of Scheria and the Carthage that has just been founded and which will be no more by Virgil's day. It does so by presenting its version of Scheria in the Carthage that has just been founded and that will be no more by Virgil's day, history's defeated rival to Rome. Carthage is nonetheless Rome's double, the closest image in the poem of the rich and sophisticated city that the future Rome will be. Both are non-Greek at a linguistic as well as a historical remove from Homer. Dido and her urbane Carthaginians welcomed the Trojan remnants who straggled to her shores from the heroic world of Troy, but the Carthaginians are not part of that world and belong to a more civilized future. They provide an enthralled audience for Aeneas's narration of the fall of his city and subsequent wanderings, and so prefigure a modern, cultured readership in Virgil's own Rome and beyond. A Carthage modeled on Scheria and the Phaeacians, however, already carried with it unflattering connotations from ancient critics of Homer. From within Athens of the late 4th century, the reactionary Plato objected to Odysseus' praise of the pleasure and good fellowship, the euphrosyne of the Phaeacian banquets. Odysseus says, it's the most beautiful of things. He also objected to the song of Ares and Aphrodite, in particular in his attack on the immorality of the Homeric poems in the 3rd book of the Republic. Philip Hardy notes that defenders of Homer had to allegorize the body's story so that Venus and Mars would embody the Empedoclean cosmogonic principles of love and strife, as they do with the opening of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, and Virgil himself apparently refers to this allegoresis of Venus and Mars in the Song of the Nymph Clymene in the 4th Georgic. Classical writers of Platonic and aristocratic leanings, Pamela Gordon has shown, condemned the Phaeacians by identifying them with vulgar Epicureanism, the pursuit of hedonistic pleasure. The cryptic Phoenician attributes of the Phaeacians in the Odyssey itself now belong in the Aeneid to real Phoenicians, the colonists who have followed Dido from Tyre. So it's with the people identified with despised trade and double dealing that Virgil links the associations with Epicureanism, vulgar and real, that Gordon and other critics have identified in the Carthage episode. These include the city's opulence, Dido's skepticism about the gods who have ordered Aeneas to leave her. Really, the gods care about that, she says. And the sexual indulgence which tempts the hero to withdraw from his heroic mission. Here, too, a female ruler, marks the merchant Carthaginians with effeminacy. In place of Demodocus' song about Ares and Aphrodite, Dido's bard, Iopus, sings a cosmogonic song about the movement of the stars, the origins of men and beasts, rain and lightning. Iopus' song is a miniature piece of natural science, and it pointedly excludes the gods. Wealthy, materialist, godless Carthage is the disparaged twin that has, like Remus, been obliterated by Rome, but which seems nonetheless to prefigure and constitute one side of the metropolis that Rome has become in Virgil's own day, the city that Augustus was transforming into marble. As Aeneas watches Carthage going up, he sees the foundations being laid for a theater. We are alerted immediately to the drama of Dido that will soon be played out in the poem with its frequent imitations and references to Greek tragedy. But the theater is also a glaring anachronism in the heroic world of the poem, a further sign that Carthage stands for a later stage of civilization, urbane, scientific, disenchanted, a world of high culture capable of producing the Aeneid itself. One would not expect to see a theater in the backward and poor Italy of the second half of the poem. There too, as in the conclusion of the second part of the Odyssey, the new Trojan War fought in the Italian boondocks feels regressive compared to Scheria-like Carthage. This backward feeling is both reinforced and complicated by Virgil separating out from Carthage the Hephaestus material that Homer had joined to the Phaeacians in the Odyssey, and by his moving it to the Italy of the poem's second half. Gold may be everywhere in Carthage, but the divine goldsmith, under his name of Vulcan, his Roman name, has taken up residence off the coast of Italy, where in Book 8 he uses his skill not to make the luxury appurtenances of a Phaeacia or Carthage, but to produce the weapons of Rome. The episode of Vulcan's casting the shield of Aeneas directly follows an Italian version of Dido's earlier banquet and its storytelling. Evander has hosted Aeneas at the religious festival outside Pallanteum and recounted to him the story of Hercules and the fire monster Caicus. Where Dido's Carthaginians are rich and listen to post-epic natural philosophy of Iopus' song, Evander's Arcadians are poor, and his story of Hercules is pre-epic, part of a deeper mythological past before the Trojan War. Hercules fights primal natural forces. The contrast suggests the violent primitiveness of Italy. Italian Caicus is in fact the half-beast, half-god son of Vulcan, Hephaestus himself. And he makes a curious double of the shield, embodying Roman history to which the lovemaking of Vulcan and Venus now gives birth. Vulcan not only returns to making armor, as he had done for Achilles in the Iliad, he does so, ironically enough, at the behest of his wife Venus, on behalf of Aeneas, the offspring of another of her adulterous affairs. Venus seduces her husband with evident allusions to Demodocus' Phaeacian song about Venus and Mars. In addition, Vulcan manufactures the thunderbolts of Jupiter himself. These constitute a conservative answer to the science of a Lucretius or Iopus, who sings about the natural origins of rain and lightning, and who would thus dispel superstition about divine thunder. Placed in a fiery cavern beneath the Aeolian Isles next to Aeolus' prison of the winds described at the opening of the poem, Vulcan's forge is a kind of underworld. But it belongs to and predicts, no less than the riches and sophistication of Carthage, Rome's modern present that Vulcan depicts on the shield he makes for Aeneas, the aegis under which the hero will literally fight in the second half of the poem. Hephaestion's skill produces the superior weapons, themselves technological marvels that will lead to Roman conquest. by splitting the Phaeacian matter of the Odyssey into the respective episodes of Carthage and Vulcan's Forge. The Aeneid projects two versions of the future Rome. They coexist as parts of the same modern city and of the audience to which the poem is addressed. They encode different readerly attitudes towards its own epic fiction and towards the role of the poet himself, embodied in Vulcan's artifice. The Carthaginian Phaeacian attitude, materialist, scientifically enlightenment, skeptical about the gods, appears to supersede the heroic ethos that Dido and her fellow citizens enjoy hearing about from Aeneid the storyteller. Dido offers to Aeneid a substitute for his martial labors and a peaceable enjoyment of domesticity and the wealth of a commercial people. Through Vulcan, Virgil may insert Rome's future into the Aeneid's epic past, but he also recruits Aeneid and epic's heroic ethos for the military-industrial complex of the Roman state, for the interests of its aristocracy and its new Augustan monarchy, a project that requires the maintenance of a religious establishment and of religious fear itself. The ambition and sublimity of Virgil's epic may need such a project as much as the project needs it. Otherwise, its Vulcan might find himself reduced to making toys for Eros, as Apollonius's Hephaestus does in the Argonautica, or he makes a horse trough in Callimachus. But it is a devil's bargain, as is the achievement of Rome itself. The Aeneid evidently does put epic, its archaic warrior heroism, and its old-fashioned religion into the service of a modern war machine and its pious warlords, insisting on their continuing relevance for the present. Warfare of today may be infinitely more complex and global, but still war. It's more of the same. It is a reading and an attitude towards epic that Virgil knowingly transmits to his present and beyond it. And it may be for that reason he wanted to burn the Aeneid. His sympathies may lie with the Carthaginian Phaeacian sensibility that the Aeneid censures for its unbelief and effeminacy and depicts under historical erasure, overcome and obliterated by Roman military success. But that sensibility persists inside the poem to be recuperated, in part in the poet's own day, more fully perhaps by readers in a future still to come. Now, like Virgil, Renaissance poets inherited epic after a long historical lapse. They took up the classical genre 1,500 years later in their own vernacular literary languages in an age reshaped by new mercantile capitalism, new global and astronomical discoveries, new technologies of gunpowder and navigation, new science, and new secular attitudes that accompanied all these developments. Renaissance epic poets repeatedly stage their modern distance from the heroic world and ethos that they depict by rewriting versions of the Phaeacian Carthaginian banquet scene. As Virgil does in his depiction of Carthage, the Renaissance poet can take a critical, even overtly hostile view towards the modernity of his own world, materialistic and unheroic. What may seem to prevent the possibility of the heroic in the poet's own present. But the poet also, not so secretly, registers in advance over the heroic past that allows a hearing for other values, secular, scientific, peaceable. Ariosto and Camoes provide contrasting cases. In Ariosto's Orlando Furioso has the most elaborate of these reworkings of the Phaeacian episode, and therefore I can't really include it. I'm going to have to just briefly summarize it. The paladin Rinaldo, I've summarized it on the page that I've just put down there. The paladin Rinaldo in the 8th century is hosted in Mantua and given a banquet dinner, and then is given a ship to take him down the Po. And as he goes down the Po, he comes to what is the site of the future Ferrara, which is where, among other things, an island in the Po, which had been turned into a pleasure garden by the Este, Ariosto's patrons, and which is compared, and this is on your handout, to the Nausicaa and Alcinous it's even better than anything that they had, which is a tip-off to the origins of the episode. At the same time, Rinaldo hears two stories of adultery and about adulterous wives and husbands. In both cases, the wives are seduced by riches into adultery. The second case is the wife of a judge, so we've come down into the sphere of the bourgeoisie. She is seduced by a gold defecating dog. He is in turn seduced by and gives up his own body for a splendid palace. The Mantuan setting allows Ariosto also to praise the Duchess Isabella d'Este, the sister of his Ferrarese patrons, and other female rulers, versions of arete. So this modern world contrasts is projected out of the 8th century, and it looks very much like the modern Italian city-state. It's morally compromised, as these stories of adultery suggest, and they're of course modeled on the Ares and Aphrodite story originally. But it has its advantages, splendid palaces filled with Renaissance artwork, and patrons for the poet. So if the Orlando Furioso finally catches up to this modern world at its end, and it is at the very end of the poem, I should have said as well, the Lusiads of Camoes have been there almost from their start and never leave it. After the initial skirmish between Vasco da Gama's crew and the inhabitants of Mozambique, almost all of the ensuing episodes of the poem are versions of the stay of Aeneas in Virgil's Carthage. In Canto 2, Mercury descends to warn da Gama to flee away from Mombasa, as he had warned Aeneas to leave Dido in the Aeneid. The Portuguese make for Malindi, where their ambassador first echoes Virgil's Ilioneus to Dido, and then invokes the example of the hospitality of Alcinous. The Malindian king is a Dido Alcinous figure who welcomes the Portuguese and listens to da Gama for the next 3 cantos, tell narratives about Portuguese heroism in the past and about its national wars against Islam in Spain, and then about his own relatively uneventful voyage. The storm of Book 6 drives da Gama to Calicut, much as the storm of Book 1 of the Aeneid drives Aeneas to Carthage, and Calicut too turns out to be a Carthage from which the hero must escape through the warning of the North African Moor Monsaide, who is privy to the plots of the Muslim traders against the Portuguese. Monsaide, that is, plays the role of Mercury admonishing Aeneas to leave Dido's city. The island of love of the last 2 cantos is introduced to us as still another Carthage. Venus had once invoked such a device, the poet declares, to greet Anchises' son Aeneas in that meadow where Dido's subtlety bought Carthage with a bull's hide. The Portuguese enjoy a sexual interlude there in Book 9, where they join all other lovers, including adulteresses, who are ensnared in Vulcan's net. In the last, 10th canto, they are entertained by a siren who sings of things not known to Iopus of Carthage, nor to Demodocus among the Phaeacians. First, a prophecy of future Portuguese wars and victories in Asia. This is the Demodocus part. Then, as her place is taken by Tethys, a Iopus-like lesson in cosmography, which uses as a prop a scale model of the universe enclosed in a crystal sphere based on a similar sphere made by Archimedes and celebrated by Cicero and the poet Claudian. Camoes conveniently labels all of these episodes for the reader to make sure that we know where we are in the epic tradition, and it seems that we never leave Carthage, although the poem alternates between bad, inhospitable Carthages that will be destroyed and good, hospitable ones. The Lusiads thus place almost all of its narrative present in one or other of these versions of Carthage, Scheria, the locus of unheroic modernity. And these appear to crowd conventional martial action into the past and practically out of da Gama's mission, which is at once a failed attempt to set up a trading pact in Calicut and a successful voyage of reconnaissance. He charts out the sea route to India, knowing that the Portuguese will return with their warships and establish an Indian Ocean empire. For it is the Portuguese, instead of their various hosts, who are the true moderns of the poem, which recounts events that were only 2 generations removed when Camoes began writing about them. They have guns, and at Malindi they give a demonstration as a supposed celebration and salute to the Sultan. It was like the Cyclopes at the smithy as the firebombs were exploded. These are the new thunderbolts from Vulcan's forge that make ancient warfare obsolete, as the arms made by Vulcan in the Aeneid had themselves represented the modern weaponry that would build Rome's imperial might and would relegate Homeric warfare to a distant, heroic past. So Portugal, the poet announces, will be a new Rome, but on a much larger global scale. But Portugal's empire will be an empire of trade, and this Rome itself may look more like a Carthage. The Portuguese possessed the maritime technology and skills of navigation that make them the new Phaeacians, Phoenicians with magic ships, capable of reaching all destinations. Camoes celebrates a Portugal that has transformed the globe into a large commercial network, where beneath the superficial differences, all ports of call are the same, a Carthage that is everywhere, starting at home. The closing stanzas, 99 of Book 8 of the Lusiads, draw on Ariosto's language in Canto 43 of the Furioso to inveigh in their own turn against modern greed and corruption. But where Ariosto sees his own moneyed world as possibly saner and more peaceable than the heroic world of his poem, the soldier Camoes wonders if his vocation is gone, heroism emptied out or tainted by mercenary aims in Portugal's great imperial venture. Beneath the poem's notorious beneath the poem's notorious double divine machinery of a Christian God to whom da Gama prays and of classical gods who respond, lies a disenchanted world of all too human motivation. Muslim traders bribe the Catwall, the minister of Calicut, to prevent da Gama from leaving Calicut and to scuttle his mission. Da Gama's main Aeneas-like act in the poem, Michael Murren and Timothy Hampton have shown, is simply to extricate himself out of this Carthage in the nick of time. An Arab fleet from Mecca, armed with cannonry of their own, Vulcan's thunderbolts, as the poem calls them, is due to arrive on the scene. But da Gama has really no place to go except to another Carthage. He and his poet are trapped in their own modernity. So Tasso's version of the Phaeacian Carthaginian banquet in the Gerusalemme Liberata occurs in the episode of the Magus or sage of Ascalon, who, alerted by Peter the Hermit, invites the Crusaders Carlo and Ubaldo into his underground dwelling in Canto 14. The basic shape of the topos can be discerned. The Magus offers them a meal in his splendid palace, which is a product of untold wealth and a locus of natural philosophy. In an inset narration, he recounts to them the story of Armida and Rinaldo. The next morning, he sends them on their way to rescue Rinaldo on the marvelous ship of fortune, which is a version of the Phaeacians' magical ships. But the pattern is complicated by Tasso's further modeling of the episode on the descent beneath the earth of Virgil's Aristeus in the Fourth Georgic, on a more recent imitation of that Virgilian episode in Fracastoro's short scientific epic, Syphilis. The Magus lives, the Magus lives in a realm at the source of rivers, and lower down of living silver, Mercury. and sparkling gemstones that fill his cavern with artificial light. No practitioner of black magic, he's a kind of natural scientist who splits his time between the subterranean palace and an observatory on Mount Carmel, where he watches Venus and Mars without any veil, as well as the slow or rapid orbits of the heavenly bodies. He looks down on the generation of the rain and dew and upon how lightning is kindled and strikes the earth. The science of the Magus can be linked to Epicurean attitudes, and it is he who recounts, to be sure with disapproval, the song of Armida's artificial siren, who advises Rinaldo to enjoy his body. Let him care nothing if the heavens thunder or lightnings. Let it menace and kindle bolts as much as it likes. Such thunder and lightning, an Epicurean would explain, has nothing to do with the gods. The meal in the sumptuous underground palace of the Magus recalls the banquets of Carthage and Scheria. His establishment in the womb of the earth is a scientific version, mediated through Fracastoro's poem, of the fairy treasure vaults found in previous Italian heroic poems. Riches, science, and technology come together in this projection of modernity, apparently far from the 11th century world of the First Crusade. So does the specter of a godless materialism that Tasso tries to put to rest. The Magus was born a pagan, thought he knew all that there was to know about the workings of nature, but then he met Peter the Hermit, who converted and baptized him. He is another man in parte than the one he used to be. And watch out for that, because that's what Petrarch says about himself, the opening of the Canzoniere. I'm another man in parte from what I used to be. And it's the Magus, suitably enough, given his realm of metals, who will play Vulcan and provide Rinaldo with the epic shield on which his ancestors are depicted. Del sangue dazio glorioso Augusto, lordint visi videa nulla interrotto. From the blood of the Azzi, glorious and august, the order was seen without interruption. By fortunate puns, Actium and Augustus, viewed as the climax of Virgil's description of the shield of Aeneas, begin the ekphrasis of Rinaldo's shield. If the episode, like the models of Homer's Scheria and Virgil's Carthage, affords a glimpse of a seemingly post-epic scientific modernity, of a literally earthly wealth and Epicurean unbelief, it seeks preemptively to recruit that future for the conservative, religious, and heroic aims of Tasso's poem. But it may succeed in doing so, like the conversion of the Magus himself, only in part. Now, by contrast, Spenser's Cave of Mammon, in Book 2, Canto 7 of the Faerie Queene, reduces this future to a bourgeois world of money, and in doing so, he demonizes the Scheria-Carthage episode. Drawing on the same sources as Tasso's episode of the Magus, and on the episode itself, Spenser first places the underground treasure cave of Mammon next door to Pluto's hell, activating the similarity of the names of Pluto and Plutus, the god of wealth, and then shows it leading into hell itself in the garden of Proserpina and the adjoining river Cocytus. Covered with smoke and soot, Mammon first appears to, quote, have been seared in the smith's fire-spitting forge. And his realm contains a forge, its furnaces and bellows manned by fiends. Spenser associates its fires, difficult to distinguish from hellfire, with Vulcan, and earlier, under his other Virgilian name, with Mulciber. This smithy does not seem to produce any Hephaestian artwork or weaponry, just the precious metals themselves, with which the money god earlier points out Gaian might buy shields, steeds, and arms, as well as crowns and kingdoms. But it may have produced a Hephaestian automata in the allegorical figure of Disdain, a giant made of gold in the 1590 Faerie Queene, of iron in its 1596 version, who dogs Gaian's steps, ready to snatch and destroy him. Gaian replies that he would rather gain kingdoms the old-fashioned way, by the brute force of arms. And in a pointed aristocratic threat against this capitalist upstart asserts that he would, quote, be lord of those that riches have, than them to have myself and be their servile slave. Mammon looks like a member of the Fugger family and which was a Fugger banking and merchant family, who monopolized mining and trade in metals. Mammon represents the new world of capitalism and its urban middle class. He leads Gaian into a throne room that is long and wide as if some guild or solemn temple were. That is the haunt of guildsmen and of lawyers, the latter like Ariosto's judge. On the throne is his daughter Philotime, the lover of honor, who fuels ambition and is a kind of alternative is a kind of alternative or allegorical alter ego of Queen Elizabeth. The bourgeoisie claims its own independent realm within the heroic world of the poem. The episode reveals its links to the Phaeacian Carthage model at the level of plot, when Mammon, like Alcinous, offers his daughter in marriage to the visiting hero. Gaian turns him down with a politeness that's bordering on sarcasm. It would be too great a theologically colored grace conferred on him, he says, when, of course, it would be he, the gentleman, who would confer honor on the moneyed citizen's daughter he might marry, perhaps the honor her name says she craves. So many Elizabethan gentlemen did, replenishing their own family fortunes in the process. Nor will Gaian eat at the proffered golden fruit, nor sit down on Mammon's silver stool. There is not going to be any Phaeacian or Carthaginian banquet in this episode. Gaian just says no to all these temptations of Spenser's present and signals the poem's aristocratic disdain for the new money of the city better than any allegorical giant. But Mammon spells out that times have changed. Thou that dost live in later times must wage thy works for wealth and life for gold engage. He is the capitalist future that is already here and that threatens to relegate the heroic world of fairyland to the past. From Mammon's point of view, perspective already available to Spenser's first and later readers, these cracks in Epic's aristocratic facade are easier to see. And I simply can't really resist this. Spenser wickedly parodies Gaian's sententious disdain for Mammon's riches and reduces it to braggadocio, in the words of braggadocio himself in the ensuing Malbecco Helenor Fablio of books 3, 9, and 10. When Malbecco, miser and doublet of Mammon, offers the impostor knight money in order to enlist him in the recovery of his runaway wife, Helenor, braggadocio replies, I loathe as dung, nay deem my due reward. Fame is my meed, and glory virtuous prey. But minds of mortal men are muchel marred, and moved amiss with massy mucks unmeet regard. The over-the-top alliteration of the final couplet gives the game away and lowers still further the low comedy of the episode. Braggadocio goes on to steal Malbecco's gold, as Paradel has stolen and abandoned Malbecco's wife Helenor, and these false knights just might disclose the true nature of knighthood. The episode further rewrites the earlier Mammon allegory through another version of the Phaeacian Carthaginian banquet, the meal that the unwilling host Malbecco is forced to offer the wandering knights who otherwise threaten to burn down his castle, and at which Paradel and Britomart each recount their Trojan genealogies in the manner of the guests Odysseus and Aeneas. Eventually, Helenor herself sets Malbecco's house and riches afire, like another burning Troy, as Spenser offers a debased version of the epic myth of Troy in a May-December story of adultery out of Chaucer's Merchant's Tale and Gascoigne's The Adventures of F.J. novellas like the ones told at the end of the Orlando Furioso. Or he reduces that myth, the Trojan myth, as the Phaeacian bard Demodocus does in the Odyssey, to the adultery of an Aphrodite and an Ares at the expense of a gold-handling smith Hephaestus, with little of the Olympian Phaeacian sophistication and good cheer. Instead, Spenser risks having the national dynastic project, Troy Novant, Gloriana, the Fairy Queen, the epicness of his poem, swallowed up into the moneyed modern world and its lower literary genres. Melbecco turns into jealousy, the ethos particular to the novel. Helen Hoare, ends up among the satyrs, that is, in satire. Milton's Eden is the Scheria of Paradise Lost, while Pandemonium is the poem's Mulciberian, Vulcanian Rome. Paradise Lost starts at the beginning of time and treats events that shape us as human beings. It cannot but look forward, Hegel notes, in order to disqualify Paradise Lost as an epic. He says, in Milton, we always find feeling and consideration drawn from a modern imagination and the moral ideas of his day. This modernity takes two forms, utopian in the Scheria like Eden, which is not primitive enough for Hegel, demonic in Satan's Hephaestion capital and seat of monarchy, at once too atavistic and all too actual for Milton. Milton gives us the epic coordinates of Eden in the menu that Eve gathers together for the couple's first dinner party in honor of the angel Raphael, the poem's version of the epic banquet. Whatever earth all-bearing mother yields in India, east or west, or middle shore, in Pontus, or the Punic coast, or where Alcinous reigned, fruit of all kinds. The whole globe is contracted into Eden, which poised between east and west takes on the milieu of Mediterranean epic, of Pontic Colchis, of the Argonautica of Valerius Flaccus, of Punic Carthage, and of Scheria, the realm of Alcinous. The foodstuffs announce the familiar topos of the hospitable meal accompanied by storytelling. What follows, Raphael's two long narrations of the war in heaven and the creation of God's new universe, correspond to the songs of Demodocus and Iopus, told here in a reversal of epic convention by the guest rather than the host. The Phaeacian model remains in place in the poem. Satan's subsequent approach to Eve harkens back to Odysseus' first encounter with Nausicaa. It casts Scheria itself as a place of Edenic innocence. Pious though they are, Adam and Eve live the Epicurean good life of the Phaeacians. Unwarlike, looking forward to the nightly lovemaking that caps their existence, they listen with fascination to Raphael's narration of the war in heaven that casts such epic heroism into a quaint literary past, made ridiculous by Satan's invention of artillery. Yes, artillery was there from the beginning, at least from the second day of the heavenly battle, to ruin the individual heroics of epic. Eden is also a realm of scientific enlightenment, where Adam and Raphael can engage in astronomical observation, much like Tasso's Magus. Iopus is here too. Adam and Eve thus live not only the beginning of human existence, but in a post-feudal, post-epic age. As Frederick Jameson baldly and brilliantly puts it, alongside the feudal world of God and his court, of Satan and his host, Adam is clearly of another species, the commoner, the first bourgeois, that extraordinary mutation which is middle-class man, destined, as we know today, to be fruitful and to multiply and to inherit the earth, unquote. The trouble with quoting Jameson is that what surrounds it does not seem so good. Satan first enters Eden in simile as a thief bent to unhoard the cash of some rich burgher. Eden, like other epic versions of Phaeacian Scheria, is a utopian projection of a modern world that has superseded epic's own heroic realm, the realm of war. It is Milton's dream of a virtuous bourgeoisie, a bourgeoisie still unfallen, and thus not yet subject to the sardonic tinge of Jameson's description. In a significant revision of his models, Milton makes this Phaeacian Eden not the region of unbelief, but of true individual faith, the more so when it becomes after the fall a spiritual paradise within, as opposed to the worldly religion of the state and its enforcers of conscience. For at the same time that God makes another heaven for these new creatures, Satan and his followers, Mammon and Mulciber, make their own imitation of heaven in their infernal capital city of Pandemonium. They do so slightly after God has made the new Eden, and theirs too is a version of modernity. the first prototype of the seats of rising and falling empires that will strew the globe, cataloged in Book 11. Borrowed from Spenser, Milton's fallen angel Mammon mines gold from the bowels of hell. Mulciper's Hephaestus, formerly the architect in heaven, works the metal into molds and builds the palace. Pandemonium resembles both Dido's Carthage and its wealth, and built in a day as it is, the military Rome that was Carthage's mortal enemy. The conflation suggests the devils are their own worst enemies and that this seat of empire, too, is doomed to fail. Such capital cities, Hugh Trevor Roper has argued, by the unsustainable consumption of their royal courts and by the expense of their military establishments, had doomed the mercantile city-states which had been the cradle of the Renaissance and its humanism and led to the revolutions of the mid-17th century, the English Revolution most memorable among them. In fact, as shown in the debates in the Infernal Council in Book 1, Mammon, the representative of the city bourgeoisie, hater of royal pomp and advocate of peace, would like to be left alone to, quote, live to ourselves, though in this vast recess, free, and to none accountable. Blair Hawksby points out that Mammon represents a double of the middle-class Adam, but a godless, demonic one. And he is swept up, willing or not only into the building of pandemonium, but into Satan's project of war and imperialism. Mulciber reappears in the visions of the future that Michael bestows on Adam, themselves modeled on Vulcan's shield of Aeneas in the Aeneid and Hephaestus' shield of Achilles in the Iliad. In the third vision, the unnamed Tubal-Cain, whose name was traditionally seen to be a variant of Vulcan, invents metalworking. The daughters of this race of Cain will seduce the children of Seth, hitherto peaceable and free. Quote, in the amorous net fast caught they liked and each his liking chose, unquote. As Milton blends the myth of Pandora, originally an automaton created by Hephaestus Vulcan, with the other Hephaestian story of Ares and Aphrodite. The offspring of these ill-mated marriages will be the warrior giants, the first epic heroes and imperial conquerors in human history, and the once godly, now made Mammons, will find it possible, quote, to live secure, worldly, or dissolute on what their Lord shall leave them to enjoy, unquote. Paradise Lost offers two versions of the bourgeois future. One, Phaeacian and utopian, that appears to supersede the royal aristocratic order and its epic fictions, and one in which that regressive warrior order keeps returning, as it had in the Restoration in England, and in which a moneyed middle class finds itself as the beneficiary and silent accomplice of a satanic military-industrial establishment. In this second version, epic and its glorification of war never dies away, however much Paradise Lost may claim to end the genre. We can ask which of these futures is our own. And let me just conclude. We can pose this question here and in other epics that I've discussed because the epic world is not, quote, an entirely finished thing, not only as an authentic event of the distant past, but also on its own terms and by its own standards, unquote. It is not, quote, impossible to change, to rethink, or reevaluate anything in it, unquote. These words are Bakhtin's, and they're a doubling down on Hegel that is influenced too by Lukács's notion of the roundedness of the epic that is Homeric world. Unlike Lukács and Hegel, Bakhtin does not romanticize this epic world as a place where one could be at home everywhere, the land of unified consciousness. There is nothing living about this world at all, and more than the Odyssey does in the underworld of Book 11, Bakhtin consigns the genre to a past that is not only absolute, but dead. Bakhtin broadly assimilates in epic the other high genres of classical antiquity in the Middle Ages, all of them to be made obsolete by the novel. His claim is transparently false, as if any work of literature could wall itself off from its readers and, quote, not permit an individual point of view or evaluation, unquote. It's based on a mistaken conception, It is based on a mistaken conception of the suppression of the heroic that we've seen epic built into its fictions. Both Singer and the listener, immanent in the epic as genre, Bakhtin writes, are located at the same time and on the same evaluative plane, but the represented world of the hero stands on an utterly different and inaccessible time and value plane separated by epic distance. The space between them is filled with national tradition, unquote. Such tradition, we are asked to believe, freezes the meaning of the epic world and the deeds done within it as something sacrosanct, beyond criticism and evaluation. But tradition does not do anything of the sort. Sacred books, and just as much, perhaps even more than great literature, which sometimes acquires something of the aura of the sacred, are reinterpreted, argued over, reattached to the present, precisely because they have something at stake in them. If one wishes to grant him the benefit of the doubt, and I'm not so inclined, Bakhtin may be isolating a particular reverential mode of reading that is conservative and class-bound in nature, versus the more open, democratic ethos that he ascribes to the novel. But epic, from its Homeric beginnings, has figured a post-heroic audience inside the poems, in dialogue with the heroes themselves, opening up a portal to the future. Starting with Virgil and taken up by the Renaissance epic poets, these moments of contact with a more modern future, and especially with more modern readers, measure the lateness of the poem to the tradition of the genre and to its celebration of martial prowess. In all of these cases, I have suggested, this modernity is linked to material wealth and technology, to alternative ways of producing human prosperity that do not depend or do not seem to depend on warfare. This modernity looks back into the epic world and asks awkward questions about the purposes of heroism itself, about the greed that is taken for granted by a belligerent feudal society. At the same time, it proposes enlightened scientific attitudes that question the religious props of that society. Through its glimpses into a future dwelling side by side with the present of the world of heroes, epic, far from being sacrosanct, depicts its own de-sacralization. Thank you. Sure.
Like one of us tomorrow.
No, I'm happy to take questions.
Questions, there are 2 mics. There must be questions.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? I'd like to hear a bit more about how it works in the Iliad, this sort of crashing of sort of prolepsis versus stuck in the past. Are there places there to be examined? I'm thinking here mostly of so much of what Virgil does in these the later epic writers is so much of that is from the Odyssey, the world of ships and trade, and there are so many banquets in the Odyssey. And I'm wondering how, I was especially wondering whether you couldn't work Menelaus's banquet in there in Sparta, especially since it has a kind of big mercantile theme there as well, where you have a case of a traditional heroic warrior who somehow seems to have upgraded to a tradesman. So.
Okay, so we're talking about the Odyssey and not the Iliad. You
Odyssey,
said the, okay.
But I do have the Iliad question. It's
Okay.
kind of lurking in the background as well.
Okay, well, yeah, I think it's Aeneid who says that both, that Menelaus and Odysseus look like, they look like merchants who were going from place to place, accumulating goods. So there is some sense in which Menelaus is I mean, Menelaus's palace, which he says, well, maybe I'm the richest man on earth, maybe I'm not, but you know, he's quite satisfied with himself. There is a relationship between that passage, surely, and the Phaeacians and Scheria. Yeah, it is. That we already have some sense that the world to which the people are returning is just not it's not as heroic a world. Something happened in those 10 years where Menelaus has been getting all of his riches.
Yeah. And I guess part of my question was also the way that crashes Egypt together with, well, in Virgil's Carthage, you have a kind of crash of Egypt with Phoenicia, and so those two banquets coming together in Carthage would be a nice, a nice thing.
Yeah. Okay. There we go.
Thank you so much. I just have a question about, I just have a question about your interpretation of Odysseus's reception of Demodocus's song. You mentioned this relationship between the killing of the suitors and the capture of Ares and Aphrodite. And on the one hand, yes, like it does seem like a contrast between this like more primitive reaction and the use of like artisan manufactured bondage and also the use of like social bonds legally. On the other hand, I think Maureen Alden argues this in a 2017 article. It seems as though Odysseus in the audience of Demodocus's song might be seeing that Hephaestus gets laughed at by the other gods, might be seeing that there's no mention that he receives a financial recompense, and we conclude the song just looking at Aphrodite taking a bath, like the gods who are looking at her getting caught in the net. And so I'm just wondering if, even on the level of the internal audience, Odysseus himself, there's a way in which this portrait of modernity is pushing Odysseus back, posing a warning that legal bonds aren't enough and he has to kill the suitors to preserve any sense of dignity.
Well, the poem clearly is on the side of Odysseus. So when he comes back and kills everybody, the poem is on his side. However, one can ask oneself whether the story of Ares and Aphrodite does not offer a different way that these things could happen, and that if you decide that you want to absolutely that you have to kill people and use violence at the end, then you can make these objections to the story and say, well, how well does Hephaestus really come out at the end of this? But there does seem to be some sense that, okay, what more did you expect from Aphrodite anyway? But it's a comic song for the Phaeacians. Whatever it is for Odysseus may be something else. But as far as the Phaeacians are concerned, I think that they're laughing along with the gods, and they're laughing along, the dirty joke of Hermes and Apollo. Hermes says, "Hey, tie me up. As long as you tie me up with Aphrodite, I'm fine." And I think we're supposed to feel that that's their kind of song, as opposed to the two epic things that are on either side of it. That's my line. Yes. But it's a great question, and it's also, you're right. The poem finally takes the side of Odysseus. That's not.
Hello, thank you. This is really interesting, even though I had to come in slightly late. But I was wondering if you were going to extend what you're doing beyond Milton, if there's another epic beyond that you would like to fit into what you've been talking about.
I think alas, that Milton really does slightly close the tradition. There is Lucrezia Marinella's terrible poem, the Enrico, which is, it's actually pre-Milton, does have an interesting moment where of a character named Circina, a little Circe, but who's a kind of natural scientist, and where some of these same topoi are being redeployed. And but it's a kind of footnote, I think. I'm not really sure where one goes after Milton. We really do get the novel, and I'm not sure that there's that this particular topos I can trace much beyond it.
I mean, I haven't looked into it in any depth, but I was thinking of Omeros by Derek Walcott.
Yeah,
perhaps.
but I mean, there's not. I don't think we have. I mean, I like Omeros. I don't think that there is a scene that gives us this kind of correspondence.
Okay.
I mean, certainly Omeros is a meditation particularly on the relationship of novel and epic, and about what happens in the modern commercial world, and whether there is any real epic left. That certainly is part of its pathos, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
Chris?
I know as in a courtroom, you're never supposed to ask a question you don't know the answer to. And I really don't know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What does Veggio's 13th book do to the Aeneid as an act of reception in your terms?
Okay, well, I mean, one of the things, it clearly part of what that book is trying to do is to dispel the idea that the Aeneid closes as it does with a brutal act of violence and revenge, but rather ends with marriage and a kind of happy futurity. What it does, it may say something about Veggio's own time, wanting. I'm not sure I can speculate that much further than that, but that it's clear it's part of its sense of wanting to get Virgil off the hook. In some ways, is part of what it's responding to, but it's also trying to normalize. It's trying to say, this is really a comic poem at the end, which it's to take one way to look at it is to take the Odyssean structure of the second part of the Aeneid, and to say, yes, it really is all about returning home and getting and unifying, not reuniting, but finding a wife. And that is, after all, part of what is happening in the second part of the poem. And here let's take the happy sequel. I mean, one could think about. I'm trying to remember what is the novel that's based on Lavinia's point of view, but it is that, Lavinia. That it's something like that, of trying to make the Aeneid more palatable for the schoolboy audiences to whom one assumes.
But not to modernize it.
Well, it does, I guess. I mean, yeah. I don't remember it quite well enough to be able to give you the answer. Yeah.
David, I was thinking of Epic and Empire quite a lot as I was sitting here because I used to teach in the course, I think it's now called English 130, that used to be called English 129, and read Epic and Empire to help me understand the books. And I guess many of the themes from Epic and Empire sort of underlie what you said today, but I wonder if looking back, is there anything you think differently about than when you wrote that, or does this cast any new light on the work you did then?
Well, thank you for that, because, I mean, yeah, I mean, what I might have said in my introductory remarks to this already overly long lecture was that it is a kind of rethink. I mean, it's trying to look at epic from a slightly different point of view than the essay that begins Epic and Empire, which was, again, one of these sort of big overview essays. And where, I mean, I do think, I mean, Epic is clearly, it celebrates a martial ethos and a particular class ethos, but that already from its very beginnings, it is telling you that there are other possibilities, and it projects. And what interests me is this projection into into a different future, and maybe a better future, which I think, which has, among other things, women are in charge. I mean, therefore, it's totally utopian. That it is materially and technologically much advanced and much more comfortable, and much less given to war. And I think that one of the things that really interests me about the way that Milton may close this tradition is that there's a certain despair about this. He gives you two different versions, but basically we seem to be living under the satanic regime and not under the Edenic one.
Good. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks so much, David. This was just such a joy. And maybe I'm just bringing out what was implicit in the talk and what I found so delightful, but the idea that Epic has encoded in it tropologically sort of scenes of its own reception. And I guess I'm wondering, and again, I'm going to do the thing where I ask a question to which I don't know the answer. So much of this seems like a literary history of Epic, in that, you know, are these scenes of reading in particular, or, you know, how do you account for this originating in an oral form? What would, I mean, perhaps that actually makes more sense of the scene of hospitality being the kind of primary scene of reception. But.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, I mean, we assume that the Homeric poems were recited at events very much like the banquet in Scheria. That you have a banquet, I mean, and they're famous for the opening of Book 9. This is what Plato hated. Odysseus says, the best of things, the very best of things is when people all sit here and are eating and feasting and listening to poetry. So it is giving us, it is clearly a scene of reception that's already there in the archaic world. By the time we get to Virgil, I mean, probably people are listening to Epic in very much the same way. That it's being recited orally, probably to people and maybe after dinner, but it is this. We are sort of seeing, and I think this continues all the way through Paradise Lost, that Raphael's telling his narrations, that this is one of the ways in which poetry, that this long oral tradition is still there, because we just have to remember people read things aloud up until audiobooks, one way to understand things like these interminable 17th century novels and very long 19th century novels is that, you know, every night after dinner, people are gathered together and somebody's sitting there reading. And that this is very much a part of what sociability was. They didn't have television. And so this is one of the ways in which these novels are being produced. what interests me is the notion, I mean, clearly this talk said it, is that it's always, the audience is projected as being a future, it's a posterity, it's a future audience that's being imagined. And also one that basically is at considerable distance from the world of the epic. The epic can imagine people who don't really share some of its heroes' values, and right there. I guess the corresponding moment in the Iliad is when we find Achilles singing the feats of heroes in his tent. That's how this stuff is being transmitted. So, yes.
Maybe I'll take us to the final question. But David, I want to ask you to maybe reflect about what is the consequence for a kind of longer literary history of the talk you just gave, because in part what you're talking about is a kind of dialectical relationship between a mercantile commercial world of the modern, and thinking of Octavius in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, the universal landlord, versus the epic past, which is Antony who will, be defeated at Actium. And I wonder if there's something about the dialectical nature of these in epic, the way in which epic opens these wormholes, that might make us think or rethink the kind of Bakhtinian and Lukácsian difference between epic and novel, to think about at what point does the novel, perhaps into the 19th and 20th century, even now, in its engagement with this dialectic, with this presentation of the kind of future tense that is also retrospective, is returning us to some of the kind of intellectual work that epic is doing and the kind of cultural place that epic has, even if it's abandoning the specific tropological tracing that you did in this talk.
Well, it's a huge question to which I'm not sure I can give a particularly satisfactory answer. But what I am trying, part of what I'm clearly trying to say is that the Bakhtinian model is that the novel swallows up all genres. The Moretian model is that the epic swallows up all genres. And that it's already, and one way to see this is that that we already have novellas in some ways included within, particularly within Renaissance epic, but even, let's take the Ares and Aphrodite episode. It's just that there are generic mixings that are already there in epic. Yes, I think that the question of where does the mercantile world fit into it is literally adjacent in the Odyssey to the world of the heroes. And the second part of the Odyssey, the stories of the Phoenician traders are also of Cretans, who are also seafaring people, are all over the place, and they Odysseus makes up stories in which he's interacting with the Phoenicians, with Cretans. We recognize that there is this whole other world of trade and commerce that's sitting there, but which is not being ennobled through warfare, and that seems to me what it is a dialectic that's there from the beginning. And if we want to say that is part of what the work of the novel as particularly as a bourgeois form, is that perhaps it does reverse these things. Part of the problem also with Bakhtin, just to spell it out, is that when Bakhtin tries to talk about the novel, partly because of his own his own political situation, whatever. He wants to talk about the novel as being something that comes from the folk, from down below, and the novel's a bourgeois form. And that's, I mean, Lukács actually has no problems with this, but it's a bourgeois form, and therefore it is trying to justify the existence of a class that is not aristocratic and noble, even though many of its protagonists will still be from the old aristocracy. So, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm rambling at this point, but I am. But I think that one way to look at this is a certain kind of reversal. That epic is still looking at things to a certain extent from the side of the dominant martial ethos, and that up to Milton, where the reversal really does take place. And that the novel tends to follow Milton in wishing to find a virtuous bourgeoisie. Yeah.
Thank you so much, David. I mean, speaking of the dialectic, I was thinking that maybe Lukács' point is not even so much a distinction between a roundedness of the epics and something else in the novel. On the contrary, one could say nothing is more obsessed with another version of roundedness, namely totality, than the novel for Lukács. It seems rather that whatever he really had to say about the epics, his idea was that the epic had a ground beyond or before itself. What is really epic for him is not so much the epics, but the epic world, the world in which the epic originates as the epic. And the novel is that totality which doesn't have an epic world.
Yeah, no,
and just one last point to this. I mean, Lukács wrote this piece as a preface to a book he has never written on Dostoevsky, and his idea was a return of kind of an epic constellation in modernity. So my question would be, do you think that this brings something to the possibility of a literary history of the epics?
Well, okay. I mean, Lukács is writing in a Hegelian tradition. And Hegel, in the Aesthetics, says that really there are like 4 epics that actually are epics. They're the Homeric poems. He's not quite sure about the Odyssey, but the Homeric poems, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, 5, and the Cid. Those are the 4. And by which he, and excuse me for a second. And because Germany needs an epic, maybe the Nibelungenlied. But that's it. So epic is very narrowly defined as being and also for Hegel, it's the primitiveness of Homer, which is all important, the world. And also the idea is, Hegel knows that the person who composed the Homeric poems is from a later period. But this person seems to have managed to completely absorb himself back into this earlier heroic period. And therefore he and his characters feel absolutely no kinds of questioning or disconnection with the world in which they live. Well, this becomes a problem when you start reading the Iliad and the first person you meet is Achilles, who's profoundly disconnected with his community and with the world around him. But this is a kind of romantic world that is imagined by Hegel, and that to a very large extent Lukács repeats in the opening of the theory of the novel, and that the hero it's the world where everyone is at home in the world, where there's no dissociation of sensibility, to use Eliot's term. But, I mean, that's just, I mean, it's clearly not right about these poems. And it is part of a certain kind of romantic nostalgia, which is which is partly a nostalgia for the Ancien Regime, even by people who were probably supporters of the French Revolution, but nonetheless have a kind of deep nostalgia for this. And that's where a certain kind of romantic primitivism comes in. But it seems to me this is just not, when one reads the poems, this is simply not the case. It's nice for theory, but theory is, when you then actually look at the poems, they don't work that way. So that, I think, one way to think is that the notion of roundedness and more of being at home in the heroic world is what Hegel wishes, and again, it's partly also nostalgia for faith, nostalgia for the immanence of the divine in the world. It's already called into question by epic from its beginning, and I just think that that's what one has to just sort of see that in that way, human nature did not change in the way that this version of literary history would want to make us think. Thank
All
you.
this talk of banquets makes me think we should move on to our reception in Phelps Hall, which is on the 4th floor. But please join me in thanking David for a fantastic lecture.